Hey there, amazing friends. I warmly invite you to join me on this exciting journey by subscribing to my channel, liking, commenting, and sharing my videos. Every like, comment, and share brings us closer together and fuels my passion to create more great content. Your support truly makes all the difference. Thank you for being the heart of this community. The nightmare of graceful puppets in the attic, the silent killers unraveling their strings in the dead of night. Briella had never believed in curses. She was a sensible, practical person, quick to dismiss her grandmother's old superstitions and any rumor of the supernatural. But all of that changed when she inherited her aunt's crumbling Victorian house. This inheritance was abrupt and unsettling. Her aunt had passed away alone, discovered by neighbors who noticed an unpleasant smell seeping onto the porch. The will named Briella as the sole heir. She traveled to the remote coastal town, half curious and half burdened by an obligation she couldn't refuse. On her first day at the estate, she toured the ground floor and second floor with mild interest. The house was large, its corridors lined with old portraits and chipped wallpaper. The wooden floors creaked under her slightest step, and a faint sea breeze rattled the windows. It would have been merely quaint if not for the strange vibe that lingered in the corners, as if shadows thrived just beyond the lamplight. It was late afternoon when she forced herself to climb to the attic. The stairs ascended steeply, ending at a worn wooden door with a rusted latch. An unpleasant, musty odor wafted down. She switched on her flashlight and pushed the door open. Inside, dusty beams of sunlight pierced the air from a grimy window, illuminating the silhouettes of broken chairs, stacked crates, and scattered antiques. There were cobwebs in every corner, shifting gently in the breeze from her entrance. Then she saw them, a row of old-fashioned puppets perched on a wide wooden shelf. Each puppet hung limp, head bowed forward, arms dangling. They were intricately carved marionettes dressed in delicate fabric. Their faces, though chipped with age, retained an unnervingly lifelike detail: wide, painted eyes, curved lips that suggested strange smirks. Briella hesitated. She had never been comfortable with dolls or puppets. Something about their vacant gazes always left her unsettled. She approached them cautiously. Dust motes drifted in her flashlight's beam, making the air feel thick. There were 5 puppets, 2 dressed as if from a Victorian theatrical show, one in a tattered ball gown, the other in a faded tuxedo. Another wore the outfit of a ringmaster, tiny top hat included. The 4th had a ragged jester costume, while the 5th was draped in a frilly child's attire, face contorted in a toothy grin. Each had strings coiled around them, but the strings looked severed near the top, as if the controlling crossbars were missing. A faint chill slid up her spine, and she turned away, determined to ignore them for now. She rummaged through boxes, found worthless bric-a-brac, old letters, a few tarnished candlesticks. She told herself she was being silly, that the puppets were just creepy curios her aunt had collected. By sunset, she was exhausted and decided to settle in one of the house's second-floor bedrooms. She locked the attic door behind her, relieved to leave the silent watchers behind. That night, she drifted into restless sleep. Around midnight, she awoke to a faint clattering from above. She froze in bed, listening. The house's old bones were prone to creaks in the wind, but this sound was sharper, more deliberate, like small feet tapping on wood. She tried to blame her nerves or an overactive imagination. Eventually, her eyelids grew heavy, and she sank back into slumber. Morning light revealed nothing amiss. Yet, each time Briella thought about the attic, her stomach twisted. She forced herself to re-enter with a determined stride. She intended to box up those puppets or discard them altogether. But once in the attic, she found them arranged differently. Their positions had changed. The ringmaster puppet that had once been on the far right was now at the center, and the jester's head was tilted upward, face angled directly toward the door. Her breath caught in her throat. Could someone have broken in? She searched the attic for footprints, forced open crates, looked for any sign of intrusion. Nothing else had moved, and the locked windows were intact. Heart pounding, she gathered the puppets into a crate to store in the corner, hoping to remove them from sight. Yet, as she picked them up, each puppet's limbs seemed to twitch. She nearly dropped the jester when she felt a slight tension in its arms, like an invisible pull on the old severed strings. Once all 5 were in the crate, she slammed the lid shut. Dust billowed up, and she coughed. That evening, she tried to calm herself in the living room, lighting a fire in the old hearth. Outside, a cold drizzle pelted the windows. She sipped tea, telling herself stories about how old houses can induce illusions. Perhaps the changes in puppet positions were from her own memory lapses or accidental bumps. She fell asleep by the fireplace. In the middle of the night, she woke with a start, hearing movement on the second floor, a gentle shuffle of footsteps. Not the heavy tread of an adult intruder, but something lighter. Her mouth went dry. She forced herself to climb the stairs, every step an agonizing deliberation. The corridor was silent, illuminated by the faint glow from a partial moon. Nothing stirred. Yet she couldn't resist checking the attic door. It was still locked. She breathed relief, returning to bed. At dawn, though, the attic door stood ajar. No sign of forced entry. Her stomach lurched with dread. Racing up, she saw the crate of puppets wide open, the lid on the floor. The puppets had returned to the shelf, perched in a neat row, each posed in a new way. The ringmaster's arm was raised as if giving a silent command. The ball-gown puppet's eyes angled at Briella with uncanny curiosity. She dashed forward and seized the ringmaster puppet, intending to throw it away entirely. But a sudden hesitation struck her. Were these possessions part of her aunt's final secrets? She rummaged through the dusty shelves for any diary or note. Eventually, behind a box, she found a small leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with spidery handwriting, her aunt's words. The entries described inexplicable movements of these marionettes after midnight, footsteps overhead, the sense of being watched. The final pages were frantic. They unravel their strings at night. Something animates them. They stand at my bed. I feel their tiny hands tugging. I can't breathe. They want me to dance with them. They grin in the darkness. I'm so tired. My time is near. Briella's heartbeat thudded in her ears as she read. So the puppets had haunted her aunt too. The final page ended with smeared ink. They are graceful killers, silent in the attic, waiting for the next caretaker. They feed on fear. I must. And then it trailed off. That evening, she tried barricading the attic door with a heavy dresser. She hammered nails across it, determined that no old-fashioned puppet would push through. She spent hours straining to assure herself this bizarre phenomenon was real, that she hadn't lost her mind. Then she armed herself with a flashlight and a heavy fireplace poker and stood vigil in the hallway. Midnight's approach was nerve-wracking. The house fell eerily still. Around 12:30, a faint scraping of wood sounded from behind the barricaded attic door. She stiffened, gripping the poker, hearing a gentle tapping, like small fists knocking. Then, unbelievably, the top of the door rattled, and something began prying at the nails from inside. She stepped back, terror choking her. Was there an actual person? Or were these cursed puppets truly alive? Cracks appeared in the old wood. Thin, pale puppet hands, wooden fingers jointed with delicate care. poked through a splintered gap. She stifled a scream as one slender arm tested the opening. The door shook in short bursts, as if multiple hands were pushing. One by one, nails popped loose. She scrambled backward into the bedroom, locking the door behind her. She could hardly believe her eyes. Through the crack beneath the bedroom door, she saw the corridor light shift. Tiny shadows flickered. The corridor floor creaked as if multiple small shapes were stepping across it. Briella's pulse hammered. She fumbled for her phone, but it was in the living room. She heard a scraping at her bedroom door, a gentle scuttling, as if wooden feet shuffled. Then silence. Her breath came in shallow bursts. Time crawled. Possibly an hour passed. At last, she mustered courage to open the door a crack. The corridor was empty, no sign of footprints. The attic door stood half broken, nails scattered. Summoning a trembling determination, she followed the corridor to the staircase, deciding to flee the house altogether. Enough was enough. But at the top of the stairs, she halted. On the lower landing stood 3 of the puppets in chilling tableau. The ringmaster puppet had its arm extended, as though inviting her down. The jester puppet perched on the banister, face angled in mocking glee. The childlike puppet, arms limp, turned its head in a slow, unnatural swivel. She nearly fainted at the sight. All 3 were motionless in that instant, but the tension in the air was electric. She could sense they were aware of her. She spun around, heading for a different route, but from behind came a clacking sound. She risked a glance and saw them moving, swift little steps, wooden joints clicking. She stifled a shriek and barreled down an alternate hallway. Reaching a disused servant's staircase at the rear, she dashed downward, heart in her throat. On the first floor, she rushed for the front door. But blocking it was the ball-gown puppet, standing upright on its tiny carved feet, the lace of its dress swirling. The tuxedo puppet stood just behind, half hidden by shadow. Their blank, painted eyes locked on her. Briella retreated in horror, the entire house now their domain. She dashed into the living room, blocking the door with an armchair. The flicker of the fireplace from earlier had died, leaving only cold ashes. She rummaged frantically in drawers, finding matches. A desperate thought formed. These creatures were wood and fabric, and maybe fire was her only chance. Footsteps pattered outside the living room door. She clenched her jaw, lit a match, and tossed it onto the crocheted rug near the threshold. Flames took hold quickly, flaring with a bright glow. She grabbed a blanket, stepping back as the door rattled. If the puppets entered, they'd be forced to cross the fire. But the handle jiggled. The child puppet peeked through the half-open door, face expressionless. The ringmaster puppet appeared overhead, perched on the lintel, peering down with those painted eyes. A wave of primal terror coursed through Briella. She brandished the burning blanket, the flames licking the rug. The puppets shrank back. Smoke started to curl. Tires screeched outside. Then a voice, muffled yet urgent, called from the porch. "Hello? I see smoke." The front door banged, footsteps running in. Briella realized someone, maybe a curious neighbor, had arrived. Before she could respond, the living room door was thrown open. A local man in a heavy coat stood there, fear in his eyes at the sight of flames. "What's going on?" he demanded. She tried to warn him, yelling about the puppets, but the words sounded insane. Then her eyes darted to the shadows under the table. The jester puppet crouched there. She saw it jerk upright, small arms raised. The man followed her gaze, exclaiming in confusion. The jester scuttled forward, faster than any puppet should move, climbing the man's leg. He shouted, tried to bat it away, but the puppet's wooden fingers dug in with unnatural strength. Briella rushed to help. She snatched a poker from the fireplace, ignoring the swirling smoke. With one desperate swing, she struck the jester puppet, flinging it off the man. The puppet crashed into the flames near the door, thrashing in silent fury as fire caught its costume. The man stared in horror. Then, from overhead, the ringmaster puppet dropped from a shelf, landing on his shoulder, tiny arms wrapping around his neck. Panic seized Briella. She yanked the ringmaster free, flinging it across the room. It skittered on the floor, limbs flailing. Smoke thickened, and the rug fire expanded, climbing up the drapes. The man coughed, dropping to one knee. She helped him up, shouting, "We have to get out." They stumbled into the corridor. Puppets scurried in the edges of her vision. She spotted the ball-gown puppet swirling in the hallway, the child puppet perched on a side table. Adrenaline surged. She guided the man toward the front door, braving the menacing silhouettes. The ball-gown puppet lunged at her ankles, but she kicked it aside. The child puppet made a frantic attempt to grab the man's foot, but he stomped it, splintering a leg. They burst out onto the porch, gasping for fresh air. Behind them, flames licked up the living room walls, thick smoke pluming out the door. The man coughed violently, eyes tearing. "What on earth are those things?" he rasped, staring at the house. Briella could only shake her head, near tears from shock. She glimpsed movement in an upstairs window, the tuxedo puppet staring down with unblinking eyes. Then, as the fire glowed behind it, the puppet retreated into darkness. Neighbors rushed over, exclaiming at the smoke. Someone called the fire department. Briella stood in the cold night air, mind numb. She watched as the blaze engulfed the house, crackling in a furious dance. The man who had nearly been attacked kept repeating, "Puppets, they moved on their own." God help us. By the time the fire crews arrived, the flames had advanced rapidly. Portions of the roof collapsed, sending sparks spiraling into the sky. The antique wood, dusty fabrics, and old insulation fueled the conflagration. Briella huddled in a borrowed coat, trembling from shock and adrenaline. She realized that the entire building would be lost. Part of her felt relief. The cursed puppets, presumably inside, might be destroyed. Another part mourned the old heritage and any remnants of family history that could have been saved. At dawn, all that remained was a smoking ruin, charred beams leaning precariously. Firefighters combed through the wreckage. Briella, still reeling, stepped forward to ask if they'd seen any sign of small dolls or puppets. One firefighter shrugged in puzzlement. There was no obvious evidence of puppets. Everything in the attic was reduced to ash or lumps of melted debris. Exhausted, Briella lingered until midday, scanning the rubble. She wondered if the devils might have escaped, but that seemed impossible. With the entire structure collapsed, nothing living or unliving should remain. Passersby murmured about the tragedy, the house going up in flames. A few neighbors hinted that it might have been an insurance scheme or some freak accident. She didn't bother explaining the truth. Who would believe it? She found the man who helped her and thanked him. He was equally shaken, deciding that the best explanation was haunted marionettes or some monstrous phenomenon he'd never speak of again. "I'm leaving this town," he whispered, refusing to elaborate. She understood. Memories of those scuttling limbs and wide, lifeless eyes were enough to haunt anyone's nightmares. Late that afternoon, Briella left by car. She had no desire to remain. The inheritance was a charred lot now, worthless for all practical purposes. Driving away from the smoldering remains, she felt a mix of sorrow and crushing relief. She had survived. The puppets had presumably perished in the blaze. A month passed in uneasy reflection. Briella tried to move on, renting a modest apartment in the city. She found a job, attempted to resume normal routines. Each night, she dreamed of wooden hands scraping at her door, of tiny footsteps across creaky floors. The nightmares woke her in cold sweats, but she'd remind herself the puppet horror was gone. She repeated that logic like a mantra. The house burned, the cursed marionettes were destroyed. Then, on a gray winter morning, a small package arrived, no return address. Puzzled, she tore the wrapping open. Inside lay a single puppet's head, charred around the edges, the paint blistered, but the eyes somehow intact. A note in jagged handwriting said, "They unravel their strings even now. You cannot outrun them." Her blood turned to ice. With shaking hands, she cast the head into the trash. She rushed to lock every door, every window. Reality twisted. Was there another puppet out there? Did one survive? She recalled that final glimpse of the tuxedo puppet in the upstairs window, retreating from the fire. Could it have escaped? Panic seized her. She realized that even a roaring blaze might not guarantee utter destruction of such an uncanny evil. Perhaps the devils had ways to slip away. She pressed her back against the wall, heart pounding. The notion that these graceful puppet killers, those silent nightmares from the attic, still existed somewhere made her entire body tremble. That night, she barely slept, jumping at each creak in her apartment. At midnight, she swore she heard faint tapping in the hallway. Gathering her courage, she flung the door open. Only emptiness. She told herself it was imagination, but she was no longer certain. Thus, her life became a precarious watchfulness. She found no trace of another puppet in her apartment. The next day, she moved to a different building, discarding her phone number and telling no one her new address. Yet always, in the quiet hours, she braced for the telltale tapping of tiny wooden feet. Sometimes, in the hush before dawn, she glimpses a small shape scuttling around a corner, or hears a light scrape along the baseboard. She cannot be sure if it's real or the echo of her traumatized mind. But each time, her heart leaps into her throat. She wonders if these silent killers, undone by fire yet cunning enough to persist, are still unraveling their strings, inching across nighttime floors. And though she tries to bury the memory, she can't forget the carved faces, the delicate arms that moved with unnatural grace, or the final smear of ink in her aunt's journal. They feed on fear. Beware their silent dance in the attic. The nightmares persist, an ongoing testament to the possibility that the puppets survived, lurking in dark corners of the world, awaiting their moment to creep forth once more. In fleeting moments of resolution, Briella considers searching for them, trying to track down any hint of their presence to destroy them once and for all. But the fear is too great, the risk too severe. So she remains vigilant, living quietly, hoping that the charred remains of that old Victorian house were enough to quell the menace. Yet the final haunting truth remains. Each evening, she locks her doors and windows, sets a makeshift barrier in front of the attic like crawl space in her new home, and prays that no faint footsteps come scraping along the floors at midnight. She can almost see them in her nightmares, slender marionette limbs drifting across the threshold, eyes wide and unblinking. They're out there somewhere, perhaps in another lonely attic or among the remnants of her burned inheritance, unraveling their strings in the dead of night, waiting to slip back into a waking world that scarcely suspects they exist.